Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with Twinmotion. This is really meant for architecture students, design students, or even design and architecture professionals who want to test out using Twinmotion and use Twinmotion as quickly as possible. So I'm really going to go across the fundamentals of just how to get started and start producing renderings as quickly as possible. So I'll go between two different rendering types. This is one of the renderings that I'll show, and I'll show you other views and how to generate effects like this or scenes like this that are quite dramatic. So I'll use this file here. The actual how-to, I'll use another file. I'll use like the urban landform design that I have different tutorials on. If I go down here to Twinmotion, this project here, I'll use this as the starter piece of how to use Twinmotion. And I'll go between the two different projects of just how you can generate these types of views. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you have Twinmotion. It's basically for free unless you are a business that makes around $1 million in gross revenue. But basically, if you're a student or like a small business that's really starting out, that's basically for free. And there isn't any limitations to using Twinmotion. My personal opinion is I think Twinmotion is probably the most fun to use out of all of the rendering software and user interface. Twinmotion has the most user-friendly user interface, I would say, in my opinion. Other people will probably disagree, but I think the user interface is very easy to understand and it's actually very fun to use. So you want to install Twinmotion. In this one, I'm using Twinmotion for Rhino. And you also want to install a plugin on Twinmotion. It's called Datasmith. The Datasmith exporter is very important in Rhino, and it makes the workflow much easier and more fluid. And so you just got to scroll down and find whichever program you're using it for. Again, I'm doing it for Rhino, so you just install it for Rhino. So once you have that established, then you can just start using Twinmotion immediately. What you want to first do is just have your Rhino file ready. So this is the Rhino file that we're going to use. And what you want to make sure of, or what you want to establish, is if you want to use materials from Rhino or do you want to use materials from Twinmotion. You can do both if you wanted to. It's not exclusive. You can use some materials that you put in Rhino and some materials that you use in Twinmotion. Right here, I am showing it as if I'm not using any materials from Rhino. So this is just like a blank file with no materials on it. It's all the same material because I want to show you how to fully use Twinmotion. So once you have that set, you're going to go ahead and you're going to open Twinmotion. So when Twinmotion opens, you're going to click on New Scene. And what I like to do before I even explain anything is I go into here and I delete a lot of these elements. I don't want my starting ground. I don't want my starting landscape. I don't want my starting base. And it's just a completely blank file, okay? Now, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to import your Rhino file. So if you go down to import down here, you can, it says click here to import a file or create Datasmith direct link. So if I click here, right, it's already going to try to read what Rhino file you have already open, but if it doesn't, you can just go back to Rhino and you can click on synchronize and it'll synchronize for you, okay? And I like to toggle my auto sync, but I'll show you about that later. So if you go here, you can click on it, right? Now, you have options about how you collapse your layers, right? So like you can organize things by materials, if you had materials, or you can organize things like collapse by material, keep hierarchy, collapse all, you see? So I personally like to keep hierarchy. That's how I do it. And you can pretty much keep all of the defaults here, okay? Now you do import. Nice. So now see, here's your model, right? Again, as I said, everything is the same material, or pretty much the same material. I think I may have added a transparency to the actual layer, not the material. So that's why maybe the glass rails look transparent. Okay, great. So once you have it imported, let me just explain to you the user interface. It's very basic, very straightforward. The user interface is basically collapsible. So everything you see here, if you click on it, it'll go away. So like this is my library of materials. If I click on it, it'll go away. You see? Here's my stats, right? Like how it's using my GPU and my CPU, and you can determine the quality. If you go here, if you want it to run faster or slower. Right now I have it on high, but you can do it on medium, low, auto, so it's up to you, depending on your computer's performance. I just keep it on high or medium and do okay. And then you just click that to collapse that. Over here, which is important, is your scene and your properties, okay? So basically, if you see here, these are all of my layers, okay? So all of my layers are here. Everything's organized by my layers. And so the way it's organizing your layers is by the actual geometry. So that's why it's really important to have your layers organized in Rhino when you import it into Twinmotion. And I can right click here and collapse everything. If I go here, I can say collapse hierarchy if I wanted to, and it'll collapse everything for you. So that's another way. Then there's also properties. I'll get into that a little bit later. And these are like your controls for moving things around, scaling things. You can also press tab to toggle through it. So like if I click on a geometry, right, I can rotate it, or it'll see how it changes to move, to rotate, to scale. I can press tab to go through those different items here as well. This is like your material picker here, right? And then this is like you can toggle the movement speed, the lighting, the perspective on here. So like here's like the movement speed. Here is that you can toggle time of day if you wanted to. A lot of these are redundant. You can actually control it through your properties as well. But again, this is just someone getting started as quickly as possible. This is like your views, top, left, right. Now, I just want to go ahead and get started and how to actually start applying materials to this, okay? So what I like to do is I actually like to collapse everything. Okay, so I have this as big as possible. That's number one, right? And then number two is I go to my library, and let's say you want to start adding materials, okay? So I just click here on materials, and let's say I want to add concrete, okay? So if I go to, let's say, concrete right here, it'll give you a preview of everything, okay? And there's a lot of ways of applying materials. So if you notice here, what popped up is how you apply your materials once you have a material, okay? So if you go down here, you can say replace material, apply to object, apply to selection. This is super important, right? If you have it on replace material, it's going to replace anything of the same material with whatever material you have it with. So if I put concrete on here, everything is going to be concrete, which I don't want, right? Some things are going to be glass, some things are going to be concrete, some things are going to be vegetation, metal. So you don't want that. So what you want to do is if you go here, you either want to do it by apply to object or apply to selection. So if I do apply to object, right? If I click on this element here and I do concrete, you see, it only applies it to this. You see, if I did replace material, I'm going to show you what's going to happen. If I do this, you see, everything becomes this material, which you don't want. So let me just undo that by doing Control or Command Z. So you always want to do apply to object or apply to selection, okay? Now, when you do that, you have this materials down here, this materials tab down here. If you click on it, it's going to remember all the materials that you place on here, okay? So if I delete this, we'll keep that because this is the standard, right? If I keep this, if I make any edits to this material, it's going to save it on here. Okay? So let me give you an example. So if I go here, so if I click on this geometry and I go to properties, right? And I click on this material. So you see, I have all of these settings I can play around with. So for example, I can change the color of the material if I wanted to, right? I can make it, I don't know, more just as, and I can save the color just as an example, okay? And, grunge, you can make it, I guess, give it more like a grunge effect, dirty effect or whatnot. And then if you click on details, you can actually change the actual texture map of the material, okay? Like the actual color of the texture map, if you wanted to, okay? That's number one. Let me just zoom in on here so you can see what's going on. Another important thing to understand is you can change the UV and the scale of the texture map, which is super important, right? So for example, if I change the scale, you see how the texture map gets like really big, the actual image gets really big, right? Or you can make it much smaller. That's number one. Okay, that's super important to understand. If you go to details on here, right? So if I go to details on here, you could then start to change the X and Y accordingly and the offset of the pattern if you wanted to, right? So you see the X, Y might stretch in one direction. You obviously want to do it together or in a specific proportion that you know works. Okay, and you can also click on here. So it's very straightforward. Okay. Now, okay, roughness is going to apply more so to glass. You know, like that's like the reflectivity, and like right now this is like very reflective, not reflective. And then if you go to details, you can again add more specificity to the reflection if you wanted to. Like you can change the reflectivity map if you wanted to. Okay. Again, metallic is about the reflectivity, ambient occlusion, emissivity. You know, emissivity is like for light fixtures. Now, that's like for basically editing opaque materials. So let's say we have an actual glass material. So let's say like I want to change all of my glass materials. What I can do is if I go to scene, right, and see my, and let me just uncheck properties, right? If I click on any of these geometries, it's going to show up here, you see? It'll show up on here, you see? So if I right click here, you see, it'll select everything that's in the sublayer. So if I go back to my library and I go to glass, for example, materials, glass, and let me do reflective glass. And then let's say on my glass layers here, right, I can just go and do select children, right? And then down on here, I want to do apply to selection. I can drag my reflective glass right onto there. You see, and it does it. So now if we look at the glass, the reflective glass properties, so if I go to properties, right, and click on reflective glass, what's really important is you want to on standard or on colored. No, I want to do basic, okay, because it'll give you more detailed settings on standard or colored. Again, the color is the same thing, right, with the saturation and if you want to give it tinted glass or not. But what's really important is your let me go down to opacity, right? Your opacity is super important because that's going to help you determine how reflective your glass is going to be and also with specular. So if I go down to roughness and you click on details, you know, the roughness, 100% rough, it's not going to reflect. 0%, it's going to be very reflect. It's going to, the clarity of the reflection is determined by the roughness, right? So if you do 100% rough, you're not going to see an image. It's going to be very blurred. But if you do 0% rough, then you're going to basically almost see a mirror image. And then if you click on details, the specular is super important as well because that's going to determine the actual rate of reflection, right? So if you make it 0% specular, it's not going to reflect at all. But if you make 100% specular, it's going to reflect. And so also with refraction, right? That's going to help determine, you know, how light bends and how images look through the glass, right? So if your refraction starts to increase more and more, right, it's going to make the images look more distorted. Same thing with metallic. If you get rid of it, you see it's going to lose some of its reflective qualities. But in general, that's like the extra settings that you get with a glass or translucent material that you don't get with like an opaque material like concrete. So that's just something really important to understand. But that's basically it when it comes to using materials in Twinmotion. It's very straightforward. You just drag and drop, and whether you do it by selection or by object or by material, it's up to you depending on how you have your hierarchy of materials and layers. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is actually putting vegetation, because that's a very important aspect, or just vegetation or people and things like that, because it's very easy. And what I've noticed, it uses probably the least amount of memory compared to other programs. So you can obviously apply a grass material, but let's say like you want to paint a material, right? What you want to do is you want to go down to populate, okay? And then if you go back to your materials, let's go to library and then go to vegetation. And then let's go to, we can do grass, flowers, bushes. It doesn't really matter because you can keep adding things on here. So if I go to, let's do grass and flowers. And let me just do, let's see. So if I click on place, right, and I do paint, right, I can go here, maybe I want to do, we can do tall grass, dandelions, which is actually kind of gross. Let's do, I'm just dragging this just so you understand how this works. You can even brush trees at the same time. If I go to trees, right, I can go here, I can drag trees. Oops, already dragged it. You can drag a tree in here if you wanted to. Bushes, right? You can drag these things on here. And then your brush, right? You can determine your brush size, right? And then you just, just start to brush away, right? Again, I would probably add a base vegetation or ground layer before you do this, okay? Now, when it comes to adding people, there's a couple of ways you can add people. And by the way, once you do this, this will be saved onto your settings, okay? Like you'll have this painted, this will be like a painted asset basically that you can always come back to. So you see in your scene, it'll always be here. Now, let's say that you want to put people on here, right? So if you do that, this is a little intense, but I'll show you the final form of this. You can go back to populate, and you can either do on place, you can do spacing, or you can do area, okay? So for example, spacing, if I go back to library, and if I go down to characters, and maybe post humans, and we'll just do casual. You can drag people on here like this, you see? You can drag all the types of people that you want to use on here. Okay, now when you do spacing, if you see down here, you're going to basically draw a path. So, and it'll follow any geometry, like it can read your geometry. So for example, we have, this landform step geometry, right? So if I go here and click here, and maybe I want people scattered up here, and I want people scattered down here, and I want people up here, people like this, right? So you see people are all up here, you see? And then I can, after this, I can control the level of density of people and the spacing of people. So path tension, I can make it really tight, really loose. Depending how much you want them to spread around the path is by the random lateral offset. And then you can control the number of people if you wanted to, you see? And you can do random order, doesn't matter. You can scale the size of the people. You can scale this down or up, the actual path, if you wanted to. You can snap the surface, align. So it's very straightforward. And so you can do the same thing. If I go back to populate, let me do area, it's the exact same thing, right? So if you go to, you can make like an area of people. So first let me just drag some people on here. And you can do groups if you want to. You can do animated people if you want to, but I just want to do people that are standing still. If I do area, right? You can make an actual area and it'll fill people inside of the area, right? You see? And so if I scroll down, the exact same thing, right? You can do edge fall off if you wanted to. That's like how much people will come off the edge. Spacing, if you want them really close together. Let me just zoom in on here. The way Twinmotion saves memory is that it'll actually show less detail the further you're zoomed out. You see, once I zoom in, it'll start showing like more detail of your model. But if we go here, right, I can start to change. It's the exact same thing as the path, right? You see, the less spacing, the more dense. The more spacing, the less dense. So the next thing that I want to show you is how you can start to edit the lighting, the scene, the environment, okay? And so if I go to, if you click on Ambiance, right, and then let me uncheck scene, this is where you can start to edit the lighting, the time of day, the weather. So for example, I can change the time of day on here if I wanted to, you see? Right? I can go to details. This is really important as well, as like the sun intensity, sun size, like how big you want the actual sun to look, and the actual exposure of the sun. You see how it affects exposure. So this is the same as it is in Enscape or in Render D5. there's a lot of parallels. This is how you can increase the ambient light, you know? So the moon intensity, stars intensity, I'll show you that later, but that's like when you do nighttime renderings basically. And then weather, right? The three that you have here, this is like if you want it from sunny, like clear sky to cloudy, you see? This is how you control the clouds, right? To like raining, you see? Back to the sun, you see? And then this is the middle ones are the seasons, right? If you want like summer, that's winter, but like autumn, depending on the vegetation you use, some vegetations have autumn effects and others don't, right? Winter, right? And then back to spring and autumn. So, and then obviously fog, right? You want to make it look very dystopian. Precipitation obviously is raining, right? And so like you'll have to use these in unison, right? So like if you're gonna have this needs to be active, and then this will help you with the lighting, and then this again is with puddles and things like that. Let me just go here. A lot of these things are so straightforward, that's why I don't even need to explain it. Then this is if you want to control your sun manually. So if you go here, you can actually put in your location and it'll find you and it'll do the sun manually. Or you can just play around with the actual month, of the year. So this is super helpful if you want to start playing around with the sun. And you see the north offset, like this really starts to help you play around with sun, lighting, and shadows. Let me just go back to this. There you go. And then here, this is if you want to add a background to your model, you see? And you can move it around. And if you click here, it'll give you things like this. Now, the next one is your camera settings right here. And this allows you to, if you uncheck exposure, then you can play around with the exposure yourself. You can do auto exposure, make things a tad bit brighter, a tad bit darker. White balance is the color temperature of your rendering, right? Field of view, this is basically your angle, your camera angle. You see if this gets more. It's kind of the inverse of real camera angles. This is like actual physical angles, right? So don't confuse this with like millimeters. This is the actual angle that you're looking at things. Again, you can add all these effects on here if you want to. Parallelisms, like if you want to make it straight, if there's parallax, it'll make your rendering straight and parallel, like flat to the eye level. Depth of field, super important. That's if you want things to be blurred out. Like you can pick your focus, like you can pick here, and then you can control the actual bokeh shape. You can control the actual blur with the bokeh shape and the aperture. And the composition overlays, that's, if you want to have, some type of thirds, or you can do thirds or golden ratio, whatever you like. This is like a cropping zone, safe areas for cropping zone. Honestly, if you're just starting out with Twinmotion, you want to try to bust out a rendering as quickly as possible, then you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Rendering, okay, I wouldn't worry about this. Some people like to do rendering in a very specific way. I would just leave this alone. I would not play around with this. Now, effects, this is if you want to play around with the contrast, the brightness contrast. I would do this in Photoshop, but it's nice to do it on here as well. Again, saturation, black and white renderings, right? Now, you can obviously save views. So if I go down to media, right, and I go here, save that view. When you click on the plus sign, it will save the view for you right away. You see? This view is saved. If I do this, and I press plus, it saves that view too. So I go to this view, I go to that view. You see? So it's very easy to save views, and you can apply, let's say like you make edits to this, you can apply the scene edits to this one. If you go here, you can see copy ambience, right? Everything you see here is the ambience settings, the environment, the camera. These are all ambient settings. So you can copy all these settings onto another rendering if you wanted to, if you liked it so much, So here's a scene, again, this is actually a great example of depth of field, right? You see how it controls your depth of field. But one important thing about Twinmotion is that it's still developing a way to create object IDs, material IDs, and other render channels. I would say that's probably my biggest critique of Twinmotion, but then again, it's basically for free and it's a full program for free. It's basically amazing. But I would say that's the only critique I have of Twinmotion, is that it's still in the process of developing render channels, which is very important in post-processing. If you're the type of person who likes to do a lot of Photoshop work afterwards, you are kind of limited in your material IDs and object IDs. So, in other rendering programs, you have a lot of different render channels, whether it's like the Z depth or the reflectivity channel or the AO or the material ID, object ID, render ID. These things are super helpful. So if I go to scene, right, and I go to properties, what you can do is if you click on a layer, right, you can give it a layer ID. You click enable and you can determine what layer ID you want to give it, okay? So let's say, for example, all my stairs, right? This, I want to give this like a layer ID of 2, right? And then maybe another object, I want to give it another layer ID. So when it comes time to exporting this, it's going to give you categories of different masks. So it's almost like material ID, object ID, but not as clear and not as, to be frank, not as good as other rendering software's object IDs and material IDs, right? So when you, let me just click on media and let me just save this view, for example. And let me go here. Let me just zoom in. And let me just add this as a view, right? When you're going to export this, right, you'll click on export. And if you click on image, you're going to click on the plus sign for image and you're going to decide which one you want. Okay, I don't need path tracer. I don't need lumen. I just want real time, which is literally what I'm seeing right here. Okay, number one. Number two is if you want your render layers, right, you need to make sure that it's checked, number one, and number two, that you have what you want on here, okay? It's your choice if you want to export as masks or not. That's your choice. And then you have JPEG and EXR and PNG. It's also your choice if you want it as low, medium, high. And then 3D mode is really meant for panoramas, but I'm just showing the basic flat renderings. And if you go, once you have that set, you can actually determine the quality of this, okay? So if you actually go to, let me just uncheck this. Let me click on Ambience for a second and click on Properties. If you go to Image, you can determine the actual size, like if you want it 4K or 8K, right? So you can determine that size on here. But once you're ready, once you have that set, just go to export. And once you pick your image, right, you can pick multiple ones. You just go down to export and then it'll create a new folder for you. If you do start export, it'll create like a new folder for you. And then from there, you can just save all of your files. Once you save one, it'll automatically export the masks with it. And I'll show you the examples of how the masks look. My file finished exporting, and if you see the image, it's going to give you the original image, like they'll call it like the beauty pass, for example, right? It'll be like the beauty pass. And then it'll give you the actual masks as well over here in a different folder, right? So for example, this is like my glass mask, you see? So everything else is masked except the glass, right? So that will, in Photoshop, you can just select the inverse and then you can overlay that selection on the beauty pass and make your adjustments. But again, I see it's limited. It's not like the material ID or object ID where it's way more specific. That's the only drawback of Twinmotion. As of now, I think they're making more updates It's still not there yet, but it's an improvement in my opinion. And again, this software is for free, so you can't complain that much. I still find it helpful. What I do is I don't make any layer IDs until when I'm actually in Photoshop and I notice that there's specific things that I need to edit, then I'll go back and render the specific layers again with the masks. Typically, you want to just have a good separation between like your architecture and your non-architectural elements, like your buildings versus your landscaping or roads, right? So it's easier to select, but then you might need more refinements. Maybe you want like just your wood facade pieces as a separate mask. That's when you would probably go back into Twinmotion and make like your B reps specific layer ID and then export again. Now, one other important thing is, let's say you make an edit to this file in Rhino, okay? So let me just go here, go back to scene. Let's say you make an edit to Rhino. Let's say you added an element or you added a sublayer element. Let's say, so if I'm in Rhino, let's say I make a new layer and I'll call it sphere, okay? Make it active. If I draw a sphere, right here, just make it big. Right, there's my sphere. I want to toggle my auto sync. So now it's auto syncing. So if I go back to Twinmotion, let me get out of media. You see how there's a sphere here right now? You see how quick it's very fast. It's not like it's slow. You see how quick that is? So it'll update almost immediately. Let me go back to Rhino. Let me add another sphere. Right here, so sphere. And if I make a sublayer, it's going to take the sublayer. So if I new sublayer, I'll call it little. Okay, and make that active and do sphere down here. Right, so that's another one. If I go back to Twinmotion, you see, it's right there. If I go to here, sphere, you see, it'll give me my sublayer as well with the B rep as well, you see? So it does it very well in my opinion. So that's also important to understand. Now what I want to do next is I want to show you this actual file and another file that I worked on before. I want to show you how you can really push the lighting and the landscaping and the vegetation. It's very quick, very easy. Just want you to understand these scenes, right? Just a very quick explanation. And so I think Twinmotion is so good in the sense that the results it gives you is very impressive. A, for a program that's basically for free, and number two, the ease of using the program and the results you get. Clearly there are amazing renderers out there who can produce beautiful renderings, but if you just even know the very basics and you're just using the very basics, it's very helpful in creating dramatic renderings. So I'm going to switch over and I'm going to show you this model and another model of how I adjusted some of the scenes. Okay, so this was the exact same 3D model that you just saw in the example video, but this one I made it in an urban setting, okay? That's the only difference. I mean, this is going to lag a little bit because there's just a lot of assets on here, but this is all in Twinmotion. I applied all the materials in Twinmotion. Everything in here is from Twinmotion. And so you can see how quickly that you can make something look, quite dramatic, and you can add decals and buses and things like this, like so. Again, these things are not that difficult to do in Twinmotion. Everything I just showed you in that previous segment is the same thing that you did here, right? So let me just get out of this full screen mode here. So for example, on the library, I'm just adding roads here, right? So go to material. I can even type these things in. I can type in road, and it'll start to filter things out for me, right? And I just drag it in there. I can even do decals, right? Decal. Right, and I can get all these decals here, right? So, and I'm just dragging and dropping. One thing that I didn't show is like these buildings that I got here, okay? So I can search it on here. So I can type in building, right? And this will take me to like the Sketchfab, right? You need to be logged in before you do this. And once you do that, once you let me just go, let me see here. I mean, I can actually go back. You can, so you want to filter it. So if you do the Sketchfab, you want to filter it by Sketchfab. And when you click on it, you can drag it. You can drag this wherever you like onto your model if you wanted to. So if I zoom out, let me just zoom out here. You want to make sure you're signed into your account. That's the only way you can download this, right? So if you go to File, you can do Sign In, right? That's how you do it. So if, for example, let's say here you just download it, it'll download it. I'm going to do this one instead because this one is a much smaller file. Let me just download this. Okay, once you have your file downloaded, you can drag your object onto here, and there it is, right? So here it is, and then you can start to scale it, right? If this, I mean, this camera angle is a little crazy. If I go here, I can just go to top view. If I go here, I can go to top view. There you go. Right, and I can scale this down if I wanted to. Just click here. Scale down your building like that, right? And then if I can go back to my view, right? But that's just another thing I wanted to show you is how you add buildings. And you can like double click on the buildings and you can edit the things on the buildings as well if you wanted to. Depending on how good the Sketchfab model is, you can click on actual elements on the building. So like if I click on this and I go to my scene, it'll literally give this to me right here, you see? And you can turn elements on and off if you wanted to, you see? So like you can change this, and like these are your frames for your window, right? You can go in and make it a specific material, or the same thing with your glass if you wanted to. So there's a lot of level of detail that you can play around with, even just on the assets or the 3D Sketchfab buildings on here. So now when it goes to the actual settings of this, the three main things that I'm doing on here is I'm playing around obviously with the lighting, the seasons of the vegetation, the fog, and the color temperature and the depth of field. Those are things that I'm really playing around with, right? So for example, if I go to scene and ambience and I go to properties, I'm playing around big time with the time of day, right? You see? And if I go down to my sun, I'm also playing around with my sun offset. That's how I'm getting the lighting that I want, right? Second thing is my fog. I do have a substantial amount of fog in here. I want it to kind of feel like a grungy city. I mean, if the city looks kind of polluted in a sense, right? And so I wanted to play around with that, and I really increased the fog, and I played around with the lighting of the sky, so it's not super clear, right? It's kind of cloudy. And the season is like almost the beginning of autumn. That's why you can see that some of the leaves are starting to change. Okay? And then on the camera, super important. So you see my white balance, it's very warm. I made it very warm. I'll show you the opposite, which is like very cool. So like right here is very cool. You see? This is like a very cool rendering. Honestly, this green person is very distracting. But there's like a very cool rendering here. It's very saturated. And then the season is a little bit different on this one. Right? So I made a very cool color. It's not that cool, but it's much cooler than before. And I want to show you something that I do in some of these renderings here. Chromatic aberration is very, you don't want to go crazy with chromatic aberration, but it sometimes gives this really cool effect that is almost like the Kodak film effect that you have in a lot of AI generated images. So that's something that I play with. 8% is actually a little bit too strong, but the vignetting and the color that I like the color and the feel I'm getting from the chromatic aberration and the vignetting here. So let me just go on the full screen on here real fast. You see there's this coolness to it, that I like. And this, I guess there's like a little bit of fuzziness to it. I think the actual architecture itself, because there's no like lighting hitting it, it feels a little bit bland. Like this lighting should actually be on here, to be honest. Like, I think that will make it more dramatic. I mean, oh, my speed is way too fast, right? This is like a night rendering, and so I mean the night render, or I guess the dusk rendering. It looks. I would say this reads better as a night rendering, right? You see, there's something, I guess, more thought provoking about this, and I will show you more night renderings, but I think this is very helpful. Again, it's very cool. I'm actually going to save this view, so what I'll do is, let me just get out of here and just do a plus sign. I should really name these views, but this is another shot on the stairs. And I'll explain what these are here. I could technically hide these in the view and it'll save it. So for example, if I click on here, right? Let me just scroll up. I have emissive accent. You see, I can hide these and then I can update the view so that when it comes to this view, it'll always turn it off. These are my light accents, which I'll show you in the night rendering. So if I turn this off and I right click on here, or you see this, you can update the view based off of whichever layers you turn on and turn off. But this is, a shot that's more close up. Again, let me actually turn on this emissive and show you the night aspect of it, because I think it looks kind of cool. Let me just go here. Go to my sun. I think 2241. So that's the night, but let me go. I have way too much fog. I would need to get rid of the fog on here. Also, my ambient lighting is very strong right now. The actual ambient lighting is very strong on here. And so this is like the bokeh effect. I can control the bokeh effect if I wanted to. I'm probably not saying that correctly, but if I go on here, I can go to properties on ambience. And I can change the bokeh shape if I wanted to. Now let me show you a night rendering. So this is one night rendering, right? Kind of like an aerial shot looking high up, right? So that's one night rendering. And then this is another night rendering here, right? I want to show you some settings that to watch out for night renderings. So when you do night renderings, if I go to my environment, your details for time of day, your moon intensity is very important because that controls how bright your night light is. So it's 1.2. If I go up, you see how bright that gets? So your moon intensity really determines how dark your light's going to be. And also it determines the size of your moon. Another thing is in your camera, you can play around with your exposure if you wanted to, right? That's another aspect. But your moon intensity is basically the determining factor of how bright your night is. So that's something to watch out for. And then you obviously need to have some type of light fixture, some type of actual light fixtures to help glow at nighttime, or you won't read anything. It'll be too dark. So, I mean, I think I know for a fact people can do way better night renderings than this. But that's basically it. You know, like I'm basically just playing around with the actual lighting and the fogginess, the weather, the light exposure, the color temperature. It's not that many settings. And then, you know, I pick views that are kind of dramatic. So again, I think this is like a really nice, cool rendering, right? A really nice nighttime rendering. Some of these don't make sense, right? Because like I have shadows here and stuff like that, but you can say that's the light from the light fixture. But I think this kind of shows off the architecture way more, right? I guess you can see it's more like a dusk. Let me just get this cowgirl out of here. Right. This green shirt person is very distracting. But let me show you the other rendering that I worked on, which was, I made a previous video about it, and I made it on D5. But this is the same model I used for the D5 rendering video, but I did the exact same thing on Twinmotion. I made a video about how to create something like this on D5. I just wanted to show you the other aspect on Twinmotion. I just want to go through my scenes and just show you that you can get just as dramatic views as you can on D5 or Enscape. So this is a great example of how I play around with using fog, right? So there's a lot of fog in this scene. Okay, this is probably a better example. This is a very warm scene that uses a lot of fog. So if I go to get out of media, right? And there's a lot of depth of field in here as well. But if I go to properties and then click on scene, make sure my ambience is selected. If you notice here, my weather, right? It's more on the cloudy side. Tons of, I maxed out the fog, precipitation, or actually I changed the season just a bit, right? But that's like basically the main factor of how this is being dramatic. And then again, if I go down to my lighting, I always play around with my north offset. It's not the most accurate with regard to lighting, but it makes the lighting more dramatic. Okay? And then if I go to camera, color temperature, I always play around with my color temperature. I don't use the default. So this is on the warmer side of color temperature. And then you can play around with your local exposure, highlights and shadows. You know, if you want to bump up or push the shadows or highlights, you can do that here. Okay? And then all this vegetation you see here is like how I showed you in the first segment of the video. You're just using a paintbrush. That's all. I'm literally just using a paintbrush. So I click here, you see that? Painted vegetation. That's all it is. Like in the first segment. I just made it very dense. And you can always go back and edit it if you wanted to. And so if I just toggle through my scenes, I have a lot of scenes here. So these are like, I did like a cool version and a warm version. So you see this is the cool color temperature. You see the color temperature is much cooler. And here, the color temperature is much warmer. You get a very different effect. And this is just different lighting effects. You see, all I did is I duplicated the view and then I applied. So if I go here, right, I'll say copy ambience and I'll apply it to whatever new view, but then I might change the color temperature and then I'll just go back and update the view, for example, right? This is another shot. This is cool versus warm, you see? Warm, cool. But I think this looks fantastic. I think this looks awesome. Again, absolutely for free. Like, you have nothing to lose here, to be honest. Again, my only criticism, or I guess only critique, is that the object IDs need a little bit more work and the material IDs for exporting views. But other than that, I find it very fun using Twinmotion. It's actually very fun to use Twinmotion, in my opinion. But yeah, that's basically it. I mean, so you see these views are very dramatic. I think they look beautiful, in my opinion. I think you can produce some very nice views on here. I hope you found this helpful. Again, this video is really meant for people who just want to get started using Twinmotion as quickly as possible, get down the fundamentals, just understand things here and there. Again, this software is basically for free, but I think this is more than acceptable for like an architecture studio or even a competition level rendering, you know? So if you have any comments or questions, to leave in the comment section below, and please share this channel with colleagues. I really want to help this channel grow as much as possible. Thank you.